So first off, thank you all for being here. My name is John Little. I work in Durham County Cooperative Extension as an agriculture and local foods agent. And if you haven't attended one of our webinars before, much of the perspective that I typically employ is one that pertains to regenerative agriculture, organics when possible, holistic practices when possible. We like to try to find harmony with nature when we can, but I do cover agriculture across the board in this area. So um, happy to be here, and I will quickly turn it over to Melissa.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, we're really happy that you can join us today. My name is Melissa Bell. I am the Center for Environmental Farming Systems Liaison for Field Research, Outreach, and Education. So please drop any questions you have in the chat, and we'll have time to get to them at the end. Um, John, if you'd like to go ahead and get started.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the first thing, let me get my Zoom window where I want it to be so I can see everything I need. The first thing that I would like to do is kind of offer a bit of a definition for season extension. And not everyone uses this exact phrase. You know, if you're a field crops farmer, you might think of that as, meaning a little something different. But essentially, as we like to define it, season extension is a way to extend the growing season kind of beyond what our natural climate is going to allow. Um, we do this in a couple of different ways. You know, one of the first ways that we can protect our crops, uh, as they're maturing into either cold or sometimes hot situations is by using one of the structures that we're going to talk about today. Um, there's a lot of examples of season extension in play in food crop production in Piedmont, North Carolina, but of course, that's not the only place where these things exist. Um, when you think of examples of season extension, you might think of a high tunnel tomato crop that can go into December, maybe bok choy that can grow all season long in some different climates. There's a lot of different ways to reap some benefits of season extension. We also, one of the things that we might not consider as much, but is very much a form of season extension, is enhancing the growth of our plants so that they can reach maturity quicker. They might reach higher sellable quality or edible quality, depending upon what you're going to do with them. And a lot of times both. So we're trying to kind of modify the environment in gentle ways so that we can get these advantages that we might not otherwise be able to get were we without these structures, So we want to amplify the crop growth. We want to really raise our opportunity to produce better crops even when the weather or the climate is not ideal, and preventing those types of damages that would be associated with different unfavorable climates. That's most of what we mean when we're going to talk about season extension today. But there's certainly a lot of ways that can manifest in what we're doing. So next, I'd kind of like to discuss some of the advantages. It's not it being season extension is, it's not linear. It's not only good all the time. You're changing environmental conditions like temperature and humidity and it might affect airflow. So there's a lot of things that you'll have to be mindful of as you are working in season extension or using it on in your production. But considering some of the advantages that season extension might bring, maintaining crops year round is a very cool thing. You can produce throughout the year. You can have a greater degree of flexibility in what you're producing when, if you're not limited to just such a narrow window. Um, Also, when you think about environmental conditions, yes, plants need water, but no, plants do not always want overhead water from rain or, to be saturated by irrigation, So if you can, in a high tunnel or a greenhouse or a caterpillar tunnel, which we'll talk about these things today. If you can use drip tape or other ground level irrigation so that not only are you amending the temperature with that season extension what's the word I'm looking for? Structure. Not only are you using that structure to make the temperature more ideal for the plants, but you're also able to control some of the other environmental conditions like when the water's occurring, how much, um, things like that. So, those are not necessarily the only advantages. One of the really cool things that makes me often encourage people to use these production methods when possible is you really have the chance to isolate more pieces of the production of those plants so that in theory and usually in practice, you can get a greater yield from crops. You can offset some of the natural processes that are maybe not 100% ideal for every plant that you're producing, you know? And if you have tomatoes in one side of the tunnel that are warm season, fruiting, juicy, vining crops. And then maybe you've got something else on the other side of the tunnel, maybe kale or something like that, that typically grows a little bit better, when it's cooler out, but can still grow when it's warm out. You want to be mindful of the conditions that exist in the entire structure because you might be improving conditions for one thing, but you might be making things not quite as good in another area. So these are things we want to be mindful of. Precise management of different conditions can be a very helpful way in keeping illnesses or pests that are vectoring illnesses, or a number of other problems from occurring and then spreading around. Also, if you, most places I would say this is the case, but if you have crops in your area, particularly niche market crops, um, you might be able to bring in either a higher market value or again, if you're just producing for yourself, it can be a pretty cool thing to continue to have really high quality, somewhat out of season crops because you were able to extend that season. Juicy red tomato in November is a pretty cool thing to achieve. Um, Also, if you are a producer, as I know a farmer for the market, as I know a lot of folks in this audience are, you can really hold on to new customers and keep them as regulars if you are the person who can provide this beautiful thing outside of its usual regular season, without having to truck it in from another state or another place far away. Um, with anything that has advantages, there will probably also be some disadvantages as well. If you are able to produce year round, maybe that means you can spread some of the work out different times throughout the year, but a lot of times that means that you're probably going to have to be doing something whenever would normally be your time to, we're going to winterize all the tools. We're going to, it's cold out. We're not doing anything other than, rotating our fields or something. Well, if you're growing in greenhouses or tunnels, then you're probably going to still have to be doing some things when it's cold, maybe not for right this second, but maybe in preparation for a little bit down the road. More work, but more controllable work as kind of a general rule. Um, that being said, creating breaks in the schedule as they're necessary for you. You might not be as likely to have that season built-in break. So considering yourself and considering your own resources and your own energy and your family, maybe your family is used to having you around a little bit more in the wintertime when there's a break, so there are different stressors that could occur when you fluctuate different elements of your production. Management strategies could maybe be more demanding. Maybe if you do have control over the temperature and the irrigation timing, and maybe you're controlling a lot of different things in that greenhouse or tunnel. In theory, you'll have more to pay attention to, but generally paying attention to those things, if you're managing those things well, can save you some work in the long run. So a bit of a give and take. um, can be more costly to produce than field crops, for sure. We'll talk about some of those resources that might enable people to get season extension structures a little later on. But yeah, planting a seed straight into the ground is cheaper than, building a structure, leveling out the ground, amending the soil, putting in irrigation. There's certainly more on the front end of production for season extension. But my opinion and usually what I see in practice is that the financial value and the workload value that comes to you through that structure is often worth it. Um, there's always going to be the notion of where does the waste go? If you're using plasticulture or plastic mulch, that could potentially create more trash, at the end. But every every good is going to have a little bit of a bad to it, and it really depends on what your preferences are. But we're happy to walk you through some of the ways that you can install beds in high tunnels at a later point. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the structures that you'll use in season extension. So first and foremost, the high tunnel, and there are a lot of people use the words synonymously, but there are some differences between the structures. Specifically, a high tunnel is going to have, it's your standard idea when it comes to season extension, and also you have more uniform climate control, meaning that the entire tunnel is going to probably have similar climatic characteristics. Heat rises, so if it's on a slope, one side might be cooler than the other. That's not typically ideal. So if you have a flat space, maybe you will have roll up plastic sides for ventilation. Maybe, there's a lot of different things you can do. They're pretty versatile structures. There are many different types of designs. There's, tons of different options for irrigation. You can use this structure and you can build raised beds inside it. You can bring, containers and pots in or out. You can also do what a lot of people do and just grow straight into the ground with the advantage of really closely being able to monitor the heat and the humidity. Those are pretty big assets. Um, if you are constructing your own, it's nice to be able to include solar powered vents. There's certainly different degrees of automation for different types of structures. Arguably, whenever you have a more sophisticated high tunnel, it might start to toe the line of, is this a greenhouse? But essentially, a high tunnel is really a dynamic system that allows extending, production into the cooler months, as well as getting a jump start in springtime. So they're typically permanent. They're typically tall enough for people to work in and maybe bring your equipment, but there are not supplemental heat sources as there might be in something we're going to talk about shortly. High tunnel is really the basic, also kind of the gold standard for simplicity and effectiveness in a lot of ways. Um, I was going to say, if we can advance one slide, I want to talk a little bit about some of the pieces of a high tunnel and some of the other ways that we might achieve this season extension, even if you don't have this, big, tall structure. But if you're looking here at this image, you can see that it does have a wall. This particular one does have a wall on either side to kind of create that greenhouse effect, trap the heat in when necessary. There are also, that the spots on the side where you can manually vent the air by, raising or lowering the walls. It's this right here. What we're looking at is a pretty simple structure, but it also has pretty much everything that you might need to, grow to start a springtime crop early or to, keep a summer crop growing late. So that's a kind of a basic example. But I also want to talk about an even more simple, smaller, basic thing called a caterpillar tunnel, which many of you all may have seen before. Um, Typically, it's a little bit less permanent, it's more mobile, it's more portable than a high tunnel or a greenhouse. And essentially, you're just going to drive an anchor for both sides of those hoops that you see. Um, and again, lots of common language between different types of structures, but they're not going to have a wall on the end the way a high tunnel would. They're not going to have sophisticated machines or, powered vents or heat or anything like that. It's just going to be anchors into the ground, holding a frame in line over which you will secure some plastic. So they can be placed, a lot of field cropping operations will use caterpillar tunnels, especially if something weird is going on with the weather. You don't have to have it up all season, but you can use it for, a stretch of weeks or months or whatever suits you with a little bit more portability and flexibility than you would with some of the other structures. There's a lot of really good resources available through Extension, NC State, and NCA&T. NCA&T has a really cool document on high tunnel production that we can send out or point you guys to if you are interested at some point. But before I advance too much, I want to briefly turn it over to Melissa to talk about essentially it's kind of a hybrid between a caterpillar tunnel and something you might install over an existing garden bed. So take it away, Melissa.
Yeah. This is just, in my front yard. Well, also on our resources page, that handbook from NCA&T is listed as one of the resources. So, but yeah, this is a simple structure that, like John, it uses the PVC poles. You can see down at the bottom there, I use a little C clamp to attach them to this. This is a wooden frame that is built to match my raised bed. I put hinges on it so that I can just hinge it open, and I can also detach it and move it to different beds each season. So I'm rotating. I use it mostly for lettuces, um, and in the fall or in the early spring, and then I can move it, rotate it, and move it. That previous picture that John showed with the caterpillar tunnel, similar to this, I use a lot of large binder clips, like I don't have one, I do have one sitting around, really large binder clips that can hold the plastic in place. Um, these clip onto the PVC poles. So the caterpillar tunnel as well, you can roll up the plastic and use these clips as a temporary way to hold the plastic up while you are working in the tunnel. I've also used a PVC bar along the front and rolled up the plastic like a high tunnel while I was working in it. So something to consider. You can get this plastic off online or at your local garden store, Country Farm and Home in Pittsburgh, and create whatever shape tunnel you'll need. It's a lot warmer in here, and you can start growing a lot earlier in the spring.
Thank you. And one of the things that we are trying to do in delivering these workshops is create an understanding that you can do these things. You can do these things on your own with your own ingenuity. It doesn't have to be a massive scale, nor does it have to use, a bunch of really elaborate pieces. You can do something simple. You're just trying to achieve these principles on whatever scale and whatever methods work best for you. We have a quick video from a local Durham County nursery. Some of you might be familiar with the good folks at Hoffman Nursery, but they produce a lot of interesting plants, and they really have some pretty cool ways of being independent from what the season is going to throw at them weather-wise while they're producing such a big variety of crops. So we've got a brief video for you all before we jump into talking a little bit more. Um, and Melissa, if you are ready. thank you very much for being with us here today. I'm John Little. I am the Agriculture and Local Foods Agent in Durham County.
Melissa Bell, I'm the Center for Environmental Farming Systems Liaison for Research, Outreach, and Education.
And today we are here with David Hoffman from Hoffman Nursery out of Rougemont, North Carolina. We're an ornamental and native grass, sedge, and now perennial grower. This facility started as a tobacco farm. So where the greenhouses, some of them sit, that was actually farm fields in the beginning that we transitioned over to covered production. We have several types of structures here, most of which we've created or use them for control of what we're growing. So that's water management, that's fertilizer, helping to extend that season, both on the front end and the back end, to be able to provide, another month of production. We have high tunnels here. We have some more advanced ones that we have ventilation on that we've used for more earlier in our production. We were doing more for seedling propagation. We also manipulate the high tunnels that we have here for depending on what types of crops are growing into it. So we'll do, if we have something that's going to go on mist for production, we'll implement that. The only system that we have in there is for water, which is a 2-wire system. And we've also built a series of gutter connect greenhouses. At the same time, we built a production facility and a soil storage facility, a water filtration and sanitation system. And then the last greenhouse that we've built was for seedling production. One of the things that is interesting about what we do is that the grasses have never been the showiest plants in the garden. And so to sell, it took a lot of education. So looking at really just how do we educate folks, talking to them about what is important and how to make these plants successful, what these plants do, what this function over beauty in some cases. Not that you can't have one without the other, but really trying to solve problems with these plants. The gardens behind us are actually used to recapture water and filter it using biofilters. And there's a retention pond at the bottom of the hill, and all of that water is pumped back up the hill into the main ponds that we use for water storage holding capacity. And then from there, it's pumped up the hill and treated and stored in a cistern. It's a 70,000 gallon cistern. And we have that on a sanitation loop that's hitting it with ozone and with a pH adjustment or an acid, a bioacid, to help stabilize that and create a more consistent water source. Traditionally, grasses and sedges and rushes are great for water management. They, there's a lot of phytoremediation type things, whether it's managing excess fertilizer or pesticide excess or fertilizer or any type of other chemication or anything like that, those plants can help suck it up and mitigate the amount of treatment that has to happen on the end to be able to reuse that water. We grow about 160 different species of the different plants, including some of the new perennials that we've added. And most of these are a part of what we call our green infrastructure collection, which is our grass solutions and perennial solutions. And we've recently also introduced some seed mixes that we worked with a partner on to be able to blend those.
I just wanted to ask you what you find is your biggest challenge growing year round.
So depending on the time of the year, water management can be more challenging in the off season. Things don't dry out as quickly. It's easy to overwater in the summer because it's going to dry out again. So you don't have if you do it in the winter, you can have a lot more challenges with root rot or other things like that. Labor is a challenge. So we have consistent production throughout the year, but we have ramping up of different things in like spring. We do probably 60% of our business in probably a 5-month period. So it all has to ship because growers need it when they need it to be able to pot them up into a different, so that they can get them to their customers on time. We have a staff of 40 folks that work for Hoffman Nursery, and then we have about 35 H2A employees that we work with, a labor contractor out of Michigan. We do try to close the nursery for 2 weeks around Christmas, and folks take PTO, pay time off at that time of the year too. So trying to manage that labor during that off month, really month and a half, can be challenging.
Because things are always growing.
They're always growing, or that they need to be watered, or with some of these high tunnels, we will close the sides up and we'll close the doors at the end of the house. And then every day depending on the weather, we'll open and close those doors at the end to help manage temperature and humidity in the houses so that you don't get a bunch of plants that are breaking. We don't change the plastic from clear to white in the off season, which I know some folks do. So with that, you get a lot higher, hotter hots in these houses. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to us to make sure that we have somebody here to open and close, check on things, make sure nothing's broken, especially in those colder months.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you chose to orient the tunnels for, wind and lighting?
When you look at the original structures, they were all east to west. And then after that, everything was north to south or closer to north to south. We've also started changing some of our plastics over to different types of plastic too, which has helped. It's a diffused plastic instead of clear plastic. And the diffused plastic will actually break apart the light particle and eliminate some of your shade. When you get into some of our gutter connect systems, there's more truss systems and shading and those types of things. So there's a lot more clearly defined shade lines. And so having that diffused plastic makes a big difference in those.
So I know you have some land where you're growing crops in the ground, and then a lot of the high tunnel greenhouse structures. How do you choose which is better to grow outside?
Some of it depends on the cold hardiness of the plants. That's part of it. We try to manage all of our liners, which is for sales, in a structure if we can. If there are limitations or space capacity issues, the next best thing is what's well rooted and established that they can go outside and handle those colder temperatures. When we're looking at the stock material, the plants, we have a variety of different sources where those are coming from. So those are directly in the field. We have plants that are in gallon pots. We have plants that are in raised beds or even lily crates. And those are actually in a covered house, so we can manage the temperature and that space.
How do you manage pests and pathogens when you encounter them? And do you have a method in place for balancing the humidity in the greenhouses and high tunnels against ventilation?
Yes, we try to do both when we can. Humidity is a little bit easier. The only places that we can manage humidity are in places with active ventilation. The structure behind us actually has an open roof, and when that draws in the air from below, it pushes it out through the top, which creates that airflow that we're talking about. So that's the best ability that we have to control that airflow and that humidity. In the winter season, we can burn air heat, and that's not nearly as much of a problem. You do get condensation in some of those houses, which can create other issues especially with seed production. But it just depends on what current crop you're growing in there as to what issues you would have. They make anti-condensate plastic, but then it's really foggy in there. So again, you have other issues depending on which direction you go. The pest management or disease pressure, we do have a lot more disease pressure. So some of that is we'll treat preemptively, so that we're saying, okay, well, we know that rust is going to be a problem starting, May. We'll start looking in April at thinking about when we would start starting to spray for those types of plants. Really, for us, when we see humidities above, I think it's 83%, that's when we know that we have disease pressure that we have to start watching out for. And it's extended periods of time at that 83% or higher. But that's been kind of our marker for potential humidity issues, disease pressure, and higher rates of that. As far as spraying goes, we use IPM and try to keep our greenhouses as clean and sanitary as possible. We use something called Sanidate to help clean the grounds. We're spraying the walls or whatever we have to do to try to mitigate or get rid of, if there's any algae or anything like that, we'll try to just clean things up. The only other thing I was going to say about the pest pressure, so we're working towards doing more with beneficials. And that's something that we're going to hopefully be able to do with how these structures are so open. It can be challenging to keep the beneficials here to be able to manage those. So between that and we do spray when those reach certain thresholds. So we just have to figure out what pest is it, how big of a problem is it, and what do we need to do to manage those.
All right. So that was Hoffman Nursery, and we would really like to thank David Hoffman for being a part of this and for showing us so many really awesome resources to do with the nursery. So we'll pass out some information and about how you can access Hoffman at some point after this. But in the name of time, we're going to keep charging along. Got a few more slides about the structures, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the management practices and the techniques. So, considering site selection, that was something that we had a couple of questions about already, and I will just say that there are quite a few factors that might dictate how you want to do this. So, very generally speaking, if you orient a high tunnel or a greenhouse in east-west direction, you're going to maximize sunlight exposure during the low light period of winter. If you're doing a lot of fall, winter, early spring production, and that is your priority, that might be best for you. That being said, where these structures are placed and how they're oriented is really going to play a big role in maximizing sunlight, but also some other things. So a general rule is that if a high tunnel is placed north of the 40-degree latitude line, which is not us, all of North Carolina is south of this line, uh, they want the high tunnel, they meaning University Research, would want the high tunnel to run from east to west. If we're south of that line, which we are, typically they want the high tunnel or greenhouse to be oriented north-south. Essentially, what that does is create as much opportunity for the different crops within that high tunnel to achieve some sun during its trajectory, as opposed to just making sure that those crops, if they desperately need light and warmth, are in the sun most of the time. Another thing worth considering is if you're in a windy area, uh, essentially you would want to orient your structure perpendicular to the prevailing winds in order to give it as much, physical structural resilience as possible. So all that being said, generally you want to place them away from trees and other structures. They're there primarily to optimize light and heat. So there's a lot of different factors that would affect orientation, but very generally speaking, in North Carolina, we will typically run our high tunnels from north to south unless we are just trying to grow a bunch of kale in the cool season, and nothing else. And I say that as an example of a cool weather, light demanding crop. Generally around here, it's north to south, but we'll talk more about that, or you can email me if you have any further questions. I want to talk about temperature and ventilation quickly. Um, when essentially inside a season extension structure, you're not just paying attention to the air temperature. We're paying attention to the soil, which is going to store and retain heat. The season, the type of soil, how much moisture is in it, the weather, all going to affect the amount of heat coming from the soil. Also, if the weather gets cold more gradually, plants inside the greenhouse might harden and be a little hardened, meaning grow accustomed to those temperatures, and be a little less susceptible to the cold. If it's really warm out and the weather gets cold quickly, there might be more damage to crops. So crops that can be vulnerable to seasonal damage would usually be good candidates for going inside a season extension structure. Um, I want to also talk about slopes and pests as well, which, um, essentially, if you are, um, y- you know, if you are growing on a flat area, you could potentially have a pocket of frost. The top of that slope is going to be the warmest because the hot air is rising and the cold air is falling. And you might want to be mindful of directing that airflow. Granted, also if it's warm weather and it's hot inside the high tunnel, that might be really challenging. Also, if you are making the plants have a good place to be, um, then if it's too cool out for the plants to be comfortable outside, then maybe the pests that were going to die off outside might also now be comfortable inside your high tunnel too. So extending a growing season can have some ups and downs as well. But we can talk more about that at a later point if anybody has some questions. Um, Also, I want to talk about selecting appropriate plants. Cultivar selection can really be used as a good tool for season extension. Um, the varying number of days from planting to maturity to harvest can, really vary, and it might be possible to squeeze in one cultivar over another. Also, there are heat and frost resistant options, which that will be more emphasized when you're purchasing a seed because that's kind of a selling point for seed. But you could be mindful of having a cold weather crop last longer into the season as the temperature's warming, or you could totally do the inverse. Transplants are generally more vulnerable to different to the elements, especially frost, since they may have been grown in more mild conditions. But that's a tangent in itself. The last thing I'm going to quickly talk about before Melissa takes it over, and I realize I've probably used more than my fair share of time, but some of the common crops that might be grown in a high tunnel or a greenhouse around here, tomatoes, lettuces, peppers, these things are all going to be very good options for, either high value crops, high value food crops for yourself or your family or for your market. Generally, when a plant is grown in a high tunnel or any season extension structure, there is the option for improved, increased yield. Also, when we talk about managing inputs, considering fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides, there's less out of control moisture. There's more of an opportunity to manage how these things are growing and maybe how they're trellised, how they're maintained. It's generally a little more straightforward, clear-cut processes than if you were without the ability to control some of these things and growing field crops. So there's a lot of value to you and to the market of these major crops. Also, a number of types of berries, cucumbers, a lot of brassicas. People will grow cut flowers. There's a lot of great options, root plants, ginger. There's a lot of things you can grow in a high tunnel. But I have talked more than my fair share. I'm going to pass off to Melissa real quick. So thanks everybody for listening, and go ahead, Melissa.
Okay, thanks, John. Stephen, I will get to your question. Hopefully, we'll have time to get to your question at the end. I see your question. So let's talk about soil fertility. Um, as we've seen, so this is contains specific environment, our high tunnels. So we want to choose our inputs carefully because the soil environment was going to be very sensitive to changes in soil fertility and changes in soil pH. It's very important to test your soil routinely so that you can monitor trends in your soil. pH in tunnels tends to be higher than 7 because you get a buildup of calcium and a buildup of soluble salts. This is because it's a limited leaching environment, increased microbial activity. Decomposition is things are happening faster because it's so warm. Use of composted manure tends to be higher in phosphorus and calcium than plant-based composts. And also the irrigation water tends to be high in calcium. So these things can lead to a buildup of soluble salts. Let's talk about the soluble salts. These are inorganic solutes that are dissolved in the soil. There are cations, things like are positively charged ions, calcium, magnesium, sodium, chloride, and they can build up to levels of salt toxicity to plants, due to the environment, minimal leaching or over application of nutrients. When you're fertilizing, you're going to want to make sure that you are fertilizing according to the soil test and that you're applying your nutrients with enough water. Some of the sources of these soluble salts can be commercial fertilizers, animal manures, composts. Again, plant material composts are better than animal compost material. And then again, our irrigation water tends to be high in dissolved salts. So what you can do is look at alternative ways to build organic matter if your pH is too high. You can stop using compost and try using cover crops. You can cover crop between rows. You can incorporate cover crops at the end of the season. You can use cover crops in your rotation. This picture on the right, it looks like this person has incorporated cover crops in the season. They're growing both crops and cover crops at the same time. The other picture looks like someone is mowing down a summer cover crop, maybe getting ready for fall planting. So you want to test your pH and salt levels or nutrient content of compost if you can before applying. You can get these things tested at NCDA as well. They have a lab that will test the pH for compost as well. And you want to continue to test your soil until conditions have stabilized. If I thought there was a slide. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to jump to this slide just because I'm talking about pH. So um, it's important to do annual soil testing, like same time every year, same lab, which is probably going to be NCDA in Raleigh, because you want to keep track of trends in your soil, right? With phosphorus, calcium, pH. The pH is important because if we look at this graphic here, we see that 7 is neutral. As our pH becomes higher, our micronutrients, our iron, our manganese, and boron, they're needed in small amounts by plants, but they're still essential. So they become less available to the plants as the pH climbs. As our pH becomes more acidic, low 4, 5, then our macronutrients become less available to plants. So that's why the pH is important. If your pH is too high, you can add elemental sulfur in the fall or the spring. It's readily available in garden stores, but it's effective, but it's slow acting. Um, and it can take years to decrease the pH. You can also add citric acid to lower the pH of your irrigation water. This is a complicated process. You can ask your local extension agent how to do it. You can leave the plastic off the top. We've done this a lot at the small farm. So you get leaching through rainfall. Also, rainfall is slightly acidic. You can ask your extension agent I'm throwing a lot of work your way, John. You can ask your local extension agent for low salt fertilizer recommendations and make sure that you're applying nutrients according to a soil test or a tissue test. So let me just go back here and mention watering and fertilizing. Drip irrigation, by far most common, buried drip line. Um, we're going to bury the drip tape 1 to 2 inches so that it doesn't get damaged. And you want to make sure that that drip line is like 2 inches from your crop row because a good way to fertilize in a high tunnel is through fertigation. So you don't want to have that fertilizer right at the little roots of the plants. This is an example of fertigation. It sounds complicated. It's not. You use an injector. So you see this is a drop in the ground. Um, and this hose will go directly to the field, but it has a little stopgap here where it picks up some nutrients in here and then also delivers that through the hose. So that's what fertigation is. And so you can apply fertilizer a little bit at a time. You don't have to put it all in the beginning or it's side dressing. You can fertigate as you water. There's different drip tape flow rates. So you can talk to someone who knows, an extension agent or Country Farm and Home in Pittsboro. They sell drip tape. They can talk to you about a medium flow rate or a high flow rate that'll best suit your needs. So pest management, we have on our resource slide, many of the resources point to articles about pest management in tunnels. So during the growing season, you're going to have both field pests and tunnel pests to deal with. So this extended season of production is going to attract pests over a longer period of time. So you're going to need a good management plan for pests, scouting, early detection, common tunnel pests, aphids, hornworms, cucumber beetles. You could use scouting for sure, sticky traps, sticky cards to let you know what's going on in the tunnel. You're also going to have higher moisture So you're going to look out for powdery mildews or blights. You can monitor the moisture in your tunnels. This is key. And as John said, that the orientation of both the tunnel and the planting can help mitigate high temperatures and humidity. You know, you open the sidewalls and you use fans. This is an example. I took these pictures yesterday down at the small farm unit, Seth's Field Research Facility. This is a monitor for temperature and humidity. And you can see out here on the sidewall, this is the motor that will raise and lower the walls. You see these walls in this side tunnel are open, and the cord going into this humidity sensor. So you set that sensor, and it reaches a threshold, and it will open the walls for you or close the walls for you. Also to note in this picture is yesterday, so these beds were made by hand and the plastic was laid by hand. You don't necessarily need a big, NCA&T does have the machinery where they can make the bed and lay the drip tape and the plastic all in one. And we did that, but we also made these beds by hand. You know, one person stood here and one person here, and they spread it out and then covered the sides with soil to hold it down. This is called the header line in drip irrigation, and then off of the header is a drip tape going down the middle of each bed. Um, Integrated pest management. I'm sure some of you are well aware of integrated pest management practices. Some are not. IPM uses the knowledge about pests and their life cycles in conjunction with weather and cultural practices to manage pest problems. When they say pests, they mean insects, diseases, and weeds. So it's integrated because it uses control methods that are mechanical, cultural, biological, and chemical. And that the goal is the management of pests, not the eradication of pests. So we're looking at ecological interactions among these things. This is a good citation here this is chapter 8 from the Master Gardeners about integrated pest management. But the principles are, using cultural, biological, and chemical controls. So you're inspecting and monitoring and scouting for to see what kind of insects you've got, what the levels are. Then you can use forecasting. If you identify your pest correctly, then there's known literature about plant growth cycles and weather, and you can predict a pest outbreak. And cultural controls would be something like excluding the pest, right? Covering your plants or altering the planting date. Um, right. So you're gonna have a strategy in place that uses mechanical, cultural, biological, maybe, and chemical controls, or a combination of these strategies. Um, Briefly, also, this is integrated pest and pollinator management. So we're going to co-manage for pest control and pollination goals. There's such a thing as banker plants, which is essentially a beneficial habitat within your high tunnel that can harbor natural enemies. In most cases, it's an alternate non-pest prey. Let's see, I think John's going to talk just for a second about some resources.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. And we still have a few minutes at the end for Q&A, but quickly, some of these things can be, maybe a bit daunting or intimidating to think of how, we know how to do this, but how can we get the resources where I am or at my farm? I would encourage everyone to look into the North Carolina Ag Ventures Grant Program, a program going through extension in every county office that actually just opened up. The grant window is until December. So if you are interested in producing some type of season extension structure for a production farm, that's a very good option. Also, the EQIP grant through USDA and NRCS. They had a couple of hiccups this year with funding, but I believe that is still a very good, reasonable source for looking into some of these materials, depending upon your goals. In Durham County, we have the Agriculture Economic Development Grant, which is a big thing around here and provides a lot of opportunity to producers. There are other comparable grants in different soil and water and natural resource conservation service offices in different counties. Also, if you're interested in financing this yourself, there are kits. There are often secondhand ones available. A lot of people getting them, not everybody using them. So you can investigate things like Facebook Marketplace, Also, do-it-yourself construction. I've seen a lot of people make some pretty awesome Frankensteined together structures. All we're trying to do is trap in the heat, and let in the sunlight. So there's a lot of ways we can do this. Back to Melissa for just a moment before we finish up some Q&A shortly.
Yeah, we just here's our resources page. So someone asked about what they should purchase. I would suggest looking at the NCANT handbook because it's a really complete handbook about getting started with high tunnels. I think that would give you, if you're looking about what you need to purchase to start building a high tunnel, I think the NCANT resource would be a good one. It's the second to last one here. It's a handbook. Um, I think we have our upcoming, our next webinar will be the small scale fruit production. And then John and I also have next week an in-person event for soil sampling for routine nutrient analysis that's free. It's on Centennial Campus in Raleigh. Um, you're welcome to register for that on the CEF sites. I think it'll be a lot of fun. I wanted to say one more thing about the Stephen's question about the backyard beds and um, using the hoops and just putting plastic over it or putting frost protection over it. And I think one thing to remember is that you want that plastic to be secure, right? You want to trap that heat inside. So just if you're saying like throwing plastic over, you want to, I use a staple gun to put the plastic over, and then I staple gun it to my wooden frame. Um, you could do something if similar, but if you wanted it to be even more movable, that you take it off and use just frost protection. I'm sure you could think of something, but the key is that you want to make sure that's a closed little environment that traps the heat if you're going to plant in early spring.
Um, Thank you, Melissa. So a couple of things just to touch on a couple of things you just said. We really hope a lot of this audience would be interested in attending our event. Our soil sampling event in person next week could probably give you a lot of insights into how to understand and to manage your soil. Also, like Melissa said, our next webinar is in a couple of months. We cover a lot of different types of plants and production methods, and if you have not attended anything about learning to produce small scale fruit, that'll be a good one for you. And then also, Melissa, I know that Stephen was asking about purchasing materials for the kind of raised bed hoop house. I know that greenhouse plastic would be first and foremost. Do you have a material that you've had specifically good luck with in building those style of raised bed tunnels, Melissa?
Yeah, no, it's just I don't remember the mills. They come in various mills for colder weather to not depending on the temperature that you need. So I just get mine online. I also bought it downtown Durham at our local nursery store. Depending on your size, it might be more affordable to buy it online. But it's just a greenhouse plastic. They're readily available. If you go online, you can look at lots of different kinds. But it's important that it says greenhouse plastic. You don't want something that's too opaque and is not going to let in the sunlight.
Absolutely. And then Scott had asked a question about how do we determine how much earlier you can start plants in a high tunnel? There are some of the in the resource page that Melissa shared, there are some documents, some NCANT and NC State pieces of literature that will give you general rules of harvest dates, plant dates, direct seed, transplant, things like that. But also nothing is going to be gospel. We're paying attention to temperatures, we're paying attention to, weather cues. Realistically, it might vary from season to season, but if your tomato plant, that is the plant that you're most trying to make thrive, into the fall from the summer, you might be mindful of what range of temperatures that plant thrives best in. To my knowledge, it would be in like the 80s of, somewhere Fahrenheit 80s. So you would probably want to be mindful of, okay, well, if I was starting this plant, would it be too hot in the would it be 100 degrees in the high tunnel when I planted it, or it's mostly you're paying attention to temperatures. Scott, I encourage you to either send us an email or send your local county extension agent, if you're not in Durham, an email for some additional instruction there. um, and then I see that Eddie has had a question about maybe converting a commercial greenhouse structure into a high tunnel structure. I think that's entirely feasible. If the frame is still in good shape and the plastic, or some type of plastic, whatever you used, has been damaged, realistically, there's a lot of ways you can do this. We just have to make sure it's airtight and that the warmth that you're trapping in does not get lost. But yes, also please stay in touch. I believe we have a slide right after this with our contact information. So I'd love for you to stay in touch with us. We're happy to help. Also, Daphne, if you would happen to have a link for the registration for the two events that we just mentioned, we can put those in the chat if you're able. I would appreciate it. If not, and if we only have another minute, we can also send those out in a wrap-up email. Perfectly fine too. And
To the
yeah,
wrap up.
In
perfect.
the
Yeah,
wrap
okay,
up.
so
Okay.
that
Also, if you guys have any further questions, email us. And if you would like a copy, everyone that registered will get a copy of the recording, but if you'd like a copy of the slide deck, please email John or I.
that's it. That's it. Well, before we wrap up, I just want to say, as always, it is such a pleasure to get to lead this webinar series with Melissa and with the good folks at CEFS. Also, very much a big thank you to Daphne, who helped us to get this off the ground this time around. Always a pleasure to work with you all, and also, these webinars are only as good as the people that attend them. So we appreciate you all and being here and contributing to us being able to do something meaningful. So thank you all so much for your time today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Y'all take care.